For 700 years, the island of Melos was a speck of peace in a violent world. They were colonists of Sparta, but they chose a different path. They chose neutrality. They believed that if they bothered no one, the world would return the favor. But in the 16th year of the war between Athens and Sparta, the horizon changed. 38 Athenian triremes appeared. Thousands of heavily armed men landed on the beach. They didn't come to attack. Not yet. They came to talk. The Athenians summoned the Melian elders to a private room. Our story follows Theseus, the eldest among them. He expected a negotiation. He expected to talk about treaties and trade. Instead, the Athenians gave him a lesson in the New World Order. The Athenians told him, "We will not waste your time with talk of justice. You know as well as we do, but that the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." Theseus had spent his life in the belief that reason, honor, and the gods themselves would protect the righteous. He had walked into this room as a diplomat. He was beginning to understand that he had walked into a slaughterhouse. The question was not whether Athens had the power to destroy Melos. The question was whether Melos had the courage to die rather than surrender. And that question had no good answer. The Melian Dialogue is one of the most extraordinary documents in human history. Thucydides recorded it not as propaganda, but as a clinical dissection of power. Two sides in a room, one with a fleet outside, one with principles inside, and the brutal, irresistible logic of empire slowly dismantling every argument the weaker side could make. Theseus tried every argument a reasonable man could make. He appealed to justice, that neutral states deserve protection. The Athenians replied that justice only exists between equals, and Melos was not their equal. He appealed to the gods, that divine favor rewards the righteous. The Athenians replied that the gods, in their experience, favor the strong. He appealed to Sparta, that their mother city would come to their aid. The Athenians smiled and said that hope is a comfort to those who have nothing left, and a danger to those who still have a choice. Every door Theseus opened, the Athenians closed. Not with cruelty, with logic. That was the most terrifying part. They were not monsters. They were correct. The Athenians made their position explicit. They did not need Melos for its wealth. The island was small and poor. They needed it for a single reason: example. Every neutral state that was allowed to survive was proof that neutrality was an option. And Athens could not afford to let any state believe they had options. An empire that tolerates exceptions is an empire that admits to limits. And an empire with limits is an empire in decline. This was not personal. This was geometry. Theseus gave his final answer. Melos would not surrender. They would trust in the gods, in Sparta, in the justice of their cause, and in the walls of their city. They were a free people, and they would die free rather than live as subjects of Athens. The Athenian general listened to this without expression. He rose, gathered his cloak, and walked to the door. He paused only to say, "We admire your spirit. We are sorry for what comes next." He was not lying about either. Athens did not storm Melos. They did not need to. They built a wall around it, a complete circumvallation, a circle of timber and earthwork enclosing the entire city. And then they left a garrison and sailed home. There was no dramatic assault. There was no heroic last stand at the gates. There was just the wall and the waiting and the arithmetic of starvation. Inside the walls, the Melians did what besieged people have always done. They organized, they rationed, they told each other that Sparta would come. The Melians were, after all, Spartan colonists. The blood connection was real. Surely Sparta would not abandon their own. Theseus knew better. He had stood in the room with the Athenian general. He had watched the logic work. But he said nothing that would break the only thing keeping the city alive, the belief that the siege would end before the food did. Hope is a lie we tell ourselves to get through winter. Theseus understood this. He told the lie anyway, because the alternative was surrender, and surrender he could not bring himself to counsel. The Melians mounted several small sorties against the Athenian encirclement, night raids, attempts to break supply lines, desperate probes for weaknesses in the timber wall. They were not without courage. In one raid, they captured an Athenian supply depot and briefly raised hopes inside the city. Sparta sent token support, never enough to matter, always enough to extend the hope that more was coming. Months passed. The grain ran lower. The faces in the market grew thinner. Titius watched his city consuming itself to survive the principle of its own freedom. And he began to wonder, not whether they had been right to refuse, but whether rightness, in the end, was a luxury that only the strong could afford. In the winter, Melos fell, not to an assault but to hunger. The walls held, the courage held, the food did not. A faction inside the city, watching the children starve, opened negotiations with the Athenians. They surrendered unconditionally. Titius was not among the delegation that walked out. We do not know where he was in those final hours. Perhaps he was on the wall, perhaps he was in the temple, perhaps he understood that what came next was no longer something he could bear to witness as a leader, only as a man. The Athenians did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. The assembly in Athens had voted. All adult males on Melos were to be killed. All women and children were to be sold into slavery. The island itself would be resettled with Athenian colonists. Melos would be erased. Not just defeated, erased. The executions were carried out with Athenian efficiency. No speeches, no trials. The men of Melos were killed because they were men of Melos, and because Athens had decided that neutrality was an act of defiance, and defiance required the kind of answer that would never need to be given twice. Titius died with the same sea in his eyes that he had watched for 70 years. He had been right about justice. He had been right about the gods. He had been right about everything except the part that mattered. That being right, but in a world governed by power, is not a shield. It is an epitaph. The women and children of Melos were loaded onto ships and sold across the Aegean. The island's entire population, a community that had existed for 700 years, was dispersed in a single afternoon. Athenian settlers arrived within months and began building their own homes on Melian foundations, in Melian streets, looking out at the same turquoise sea. Thucydides recorded all of this without editorial comment. He did not say it was wrong. He did not say it was right. He simply wrote it down in the same cold, precise prose he used to record troop movements and weather patterns. The massacre of Melos was, to Thucydides, a fact of the world. The most terrible kind of fact, the kind that proves a theory. The following year, Athens launched the Sicilian expedition, the largest military operation in Greek history. 200 ships, 40,000 men. The target was Syracuse, the greatest city in the Western Mediterranean. The Athenian assembly voted for it with the same logic they had used against Melos. We are the strongest, therefore we will succeed. The entire fleet was destroyed, every ship, almost every man. The commanders were executed. The treasury was emptied. The allies began to defect. The Spartan general Lysander, funded by Persian gold, rebuilt a fleet that Athens could not match. 13 years after Melos, Athens surrendered. Its walls were torn down to the music of flutes. The democracy that had sent Titius to his death died by the same logic it had used to kill him. The belief that power has no limit, right up until the moment it does. The strong do what they can, and then, eventually, they cannot. And the silence that follows is indistinguishable from the silence of Melos,